So just to give you a heads up. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. This is a big presentation, so we'll go ahead and get started and kind of dive right into it. This is the last of the 3 classes for our webinar series. So we have this National Food Justice class. Then next Monday or next Tuesday, we're going to have a local food justice class, really focus on local issues and how we can locally get involved locally and support food justice movements in DC. And then the last class is going to be about like harvesting and all different kinds of edible things in your gardens that you didn't know about, like maybe like broccoli stalks and beet tops and stuff like that. But yeah, today's class. So just give you a heads up. Today's class, it's a lot. We used to have an 8-class food justice series, and each one of these topics used to have their own 2-hour class, which we still we may do that again. I'd love to bring that back, but we wanted to just create like a highlight class of all the different food justice issues, because food justice is a very big topic. It covers a lot of things. I think a lot of times we approach it as just like a food access thing. Like, here's a community that has, doesn't have access to healthy food. Let's just get them healthy food, problem solved. But the reality is there's a lot of things behind why they don't have, access to healthy food. There's a lot, and it's not just about getting food, but it's also creating, fair and just food systems, for our workers, for the environment, for animals. It's about understanding our history. We're taught a very Eurocentric kind of whitewashed history, and things don't make sense when you're taught that history. So it's about understanding our real history and a lot of the injustices in the systems that we're still dealing with today. So it's a huge topic. But we want to just kind of highlight just a few things just to make people familiar, and hopefully once you're familiar, you'll be able to learn and pick up more through your own experiences. But it is a big class. I tend to get a bit of a panic attack right before I start this classes, because we're going to be bouncing around everywhere. But this is why we record these classes, which I need to double check that I'm recording. Actually, yeah, we are recording. Cool. On me right now. Sorry. All right. So we do record these, we do share the slides, so don't feel like you have to understand everything. We have a lot more class to kind of, I do a lot of side projects, a lot of anti-racism and racial history and projects I'll talk about a little bit later. So if you do want to dive deeper into these histories and understand these systems better, there's a lot of opportunities, but this class is just like kind of a surface level, just kind of getting a general understanding of all the different types of food justice issues that we're going through. So definitely, yeah, just kind of take it how it is. But for sure, we're going to talk about a lot of things. Next class is going to be really where we start focusing on how we make better systems and how we, advocate locally and things like that. So this is mainly just going to be an overview of the issues. So. As I also do, so we're going to talk about what is food justice. We're going to talk about the history of our industrial food system, going all the way back to our colonial times and understanding how a lot of systems that were in place are still in place today. We're going to talk about a lot of, the issues dealing with our workers in our food systems, from farmers to restaurant workers to food processors and things like that. We're going to talk about, different, farm worker rights campaigns and international campaigns to be aware of. Talk about food workers' rights. A little bit about environmental injustice and how that plays into into our food system. We'll talk a little bit about animal welfare and just some responsible consumerism and how we can actually make a difference just by how we choose but like I was saying, there's a lot of other extra opportunities. So this is a course I started last summer. So I used to be a history teacher, and I did a master's in history, and I really focus on. So I have to admit, when I taught history in high school, it is a very, it's an incomplete history. Just to be, it's the nicest way I can say it. we really don't understand. In general, we don't teach like the real realities of our history. So I created this. It's a multimedia lecture series last summer about just all the different types of like white supremacy and racism that we see throughout our country, and it's like 90% history that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to be relaunching it as a webinar series this summer, not in the big 15-class course, but more like smaller thematic units. So if you we're going to be touching on a lot of history, a lot of histories and a lot of oppressive systems. So if you want to have a deeper dive into this stuff, definitely, and you're interested in these classes, send me an email. I have an email list of people that I'll send out to when this class is ready sometime this summer. But for sure. Any questions on that and things like that, but yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So our first section is just about what is food justice, and so this is a really great definition by Just Food, this amazing food justice organization, where they talk. So their definition is food justice is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. Healthy food is fresh, nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate, and grown locally with care for the well-being workers, and animals. People practicing food justice leads to a strong local food system, self-reliant communities, and a healthy environment. So some of the really key points of this is like I think about is like what type of food that we're talking about. I mean, is this just about there's a poor community, let's just give them whatever and feed them, or are we talking about bringing them food with dignity, giving them power over their food system, have culturally appropriate food, nutritious and affordable food? This isn't just about giving them some processed food and being all right. Let's give them food that's it's going to increase the overall public health of these communities, and let's give them power over that food system and choices over what that food looks like. And also it's not just about meeting the needs of people, but also creating just food systems that actually repair our land, not destroy our land, actually support workers and animals and things like that. So it has a local focus as well. So it's definitely not all that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of really important campaigns that we're going to talk about today that do need our help to support, but when possible, there are a lot of local, we're going to talk about ways to get, create these local systems. And then, like I said, next class, we're really going to dive into how do we specifically do that for DC, and what are the current efforts that are happening right now. So, all right, so we're going to start out the first class with my all-time favorite TED Talk ever, LaDonna Redmond. She's an amazing food justice advocate in, I want to say Chicago, I believe Chicago. Yeah, she'll talk a little bit about it. But this is just a fantastic kind of summary of what is food justice and all the things that it hosts. So I am going to play it, but if you don't hear it, we did a sound check. I said it was a little choppy. I apologize if it's choppy. It's being we did this class last night, and it wasn't choppy on the recording. So if you can't hear it so well, you can definitely catch it on the recording. But let me know if you don't hear it. Just let me know in the chat box. But we'll go ahead and start this.
Well, I stand strong on those that come before me. I have to call on my ancestors and let them know that I have not forgotten them. I stand strong because I stand on the shoulders of your ancestors as well. I want them to know that I have not forgotten them. I am an activist. I've always been an activist. I always will be an activist. And I became a food activist because my son, Wade, developed food allergies at a very early age. He's allergic to all dairy products, shellfish, eggs, and peanuts. And I wanted to get the healthiest food that I wanted, food that was free from genetically modified organisms. I wanted food that was free from pesticides. I wanted food, basically, that was grown healthy, organically. I really wasn't any different than any other mother in my community. I wanted the best for my son. I want the best for both of my children. But that food, the best food, was not available in my neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. So to change that situation, I got involved with what I really didn't know at the time was food justice. We started converting vacant lots to urban farm sites lots that had not been used in decades. Food on them. We started to hire people from the community, and we started to build what we thought would be a local food system that responded to urban concerns. And so for me, the food system looked something like this. It was very simple, not too complicated, but that was what I understood the food system to be. And then I was introduced to this larger food movement, the one that says, you know, you have to eat well, don't eat too much, eat mostly plants. I'm like, yes, I got that. I'm with that 100%. But where's my food? And I live in a community where I can get a semi-automatic weapon quicker than I can get a tomato. A lot of people are trying to make this statement cute. They said that you could get ketchup quicker than you can get a tomato. I want us to really appreciate the public health message that I'm trying to get across here. And it's that the public health issue of violence is connected to the public health issue of chronic diet-related diseases. It's not about cute phrases or cute terms. It is about life and death. In my community, it is about living or dying. You can die by the gun or die from lack of the proper food. But still, the food system has not changed. I've done all this work. We know all of these things, but the food system still remained like that. And then I started to think, you know, I really have to step this up a notch. What is food justice 2.0? Well, for me, food justice 2.0 is really about the narratives of people of color and beginning to understand that the story that we tell ourselves in the food movement is as important as the stories that we've left out. For me, the food justice movement tells the story of colonialism and the impact of historical trauma on communities of color. Food justice talks about manifest destiny. It talks about settling the land in the West, the 19th century philosophy. It's like, we're going to go West. We're going to settle the land. But in food justice, we know that there were Native American people there. We know that they were pushed off of that land, them killed, so that others might be able to live. Now, we know that that's not the fault of the arriving European immigrants. But we must understand that the land that we stand on it because someone else's blood is also on it. We understand that food has been used as a weapon. Food used as a weapon during that period of time was used to push people off of land. We understand that the movement of people for the purposes of exploitation is a part of our food justice movement. We understand that the importation of African slaves in the United States, the enslavement of the Africans, provided the labor for what we now call our industrial food system. At the very beginning, folk were forced to work the land, and they had no choice in the economy. They were not paid. At the core of what I believe to be the problems in our community, particularly when we start to talk about the accumulation of wealth or the lack of health, really the conversation around slavery that has not been had in the United States. We have not reconciled the event of slavery or its impact. We have to understand that the Africans that were in the South after slavery were pretty much still enslaved after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. We also want to recognize in the food justice movement that the Homestead Act and the Emancipation Proclamation were signed at the same time, but the Africans could not take advantage of the Homestead Act, so they were forced to stay in the South and stay in a version of sharecropping through the Black codes, and then be forced out of the South through the Jim Crow laws and up into the North to a different version of racism and slavery. The food justice movement understands that in the 1960s, there are lots of things. But in the 1960s for us, that's where civil rights meets food justice, right at the Woolworth Lunch in 1963, where those students sat down and demanded the right to be treated as a human being. So for us, food justice is not just about the nutrition. That's important. It's not just about growing the food, but it's about dignity. The 1960s also represent a time where the Black Panther Party started the free breakfast program in Oklahoma. We call these things into being because sometimes in the narrative of the larger food movement, it gets lost. In the 1960s, we talk about the hippie generation and the back to the land movement and the beginnings of organic food. And all of that is true and wonderful. And we like those stories too. Both and have to exist. And so we have to begin narrative or tell a story and develop a narrative that's much more robust than the narrative we tell ourselves today. We must also include in this narrative modern day slavery. We cannot forget that our food system today is still based on the exploitation of the labor of immigrants in this. We are talking about access to free-range chickens and grass-fed beef. We need to also be talking about fair wages for those farm workers and the entire food chain workers. Also, the people who serve us, the people who fix our food also should be paid fairly. We have to say no to food deserts. I don't live in a food desert. I never have. Food desert, the phrase, is another one of those cute terms masking the harm of the food system in my community. It really is the Trojan horse of increased corporate control of the food system. I was not digging in the dirt on the west side of Chicago, thinking that I sure will be glad when that Walmart comes and builds that store there. That was not my thought. And yet there's still people who are hungry. And many of us would say, you know, let's build a let's get one of those 501c3s, let's get some more grants, let's get the foundations in here, let's fix the problem. That's fine. The food justice movement is calling for jobs, economic justice. Let's pay people, not just raise the minimum wage, let's pay people a living so that they are not hungry. Let's address really the core issue of hunger, poverty. And so as we try to say, you know, well, maybe there's some period of time where we could go back and we could find the fair, just, and healthy food system that we're looking for. If we could just go back to the time where the food system is lit by the sun, driven by the energy of the sun, we will just be great. If we could just go back, we could turn back time. The food justice movement would tell you that that time does not exist. There has never been a fair, just, or healthy food system in the United States of America. And so, it's a global food industrial complex. This is what we have to dismantle. This is what we have to address. And there's a way to address it. We can be successful if we're able to really recognize that we have never, ever had a food system, and we must join together, create a narrative where all of us can sit around the table and create the food system that we need. We have to return to the kitchens of our ancestors, the tables of our ancestors. Reclaim your kitchens, reclaim your stove, your table, your grill. Reclaim it, cook your food, make your food, know where your food comes from, but we must organize. We have to come together across this country and turn our nonprofit will into political will to change the food system. Because we absolutely have to go beyond the Farm Bill. We can't keep talking about the Farm Bill and thinking that the Farm Bill is the vehicle to change our food system. Clearly, it is not. So what's the vision? My vision is that We have President Obama sign an executive order mandating food justice for the United States, much like the environmental justice executive order. It's my hope and my dream that you will join me in the journey to change our food system.
Right. So I forgot to mention that this was taped back in 2012. Which is why she was talking about the executive order with Obama. Yeah, I would love to. I mean, if people have a couple comments, a couple, if you want to unmute yourself and talk a little bit. Normally we have some type of discussion after this before we move on. But I know a couple people mentioned things just how important like immigration reform is, and it's not just about like our food, but it's about all our systems that create our food systems. A lot of times I think we forget that, and we think that we're in these little bubbles that are just like creating these sustainable awesome projects. We don't realize the bigger systems that these bubbles are in. And also, I want to point out too, we're going to talk more about like she mentioned about food deserts and food deserts. It was a great term that it was very intentional, trying to figure out why communities are very food insecure, but ultimately it just approached this issue as an access issue. It's just like, look at this community, it doesn't have food. Let's just figure out how to get food. And I mean, that's great. Yes, we need to do that. Also, we need to understand like all the concepts underneath that are causing this food access. Some of them have been like centuries in the making, and that's why we'll talk more about this next class, but we're moving, the food justice movement is moving towards away from food access approach and more to what's called a food apartheid approach, where we are actually start understanding the policies and the histories that created this food insecurity. So we'll talk a lot more about that next class. Cool. So Jason said that was a pretty powerful reminder about how much of our food production delivery is more than just growing plants or raising chickens. It's also about people, definitely. The historical context is a nice reminder, too, that there are better days in the past, but better days in the future. I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic. Cool. Well, yeah, if anyone else has any comments or what, but I think some of the things, I mean, we're going to talk about, we're going to dive deeper into most of the things that she's talked about, from the histories to the understandings to the colonial times, and how, our system is still, the framework is of using exploited labor. I mean, that was like, it's still in, it was created, 400 years ago, and it's still what we base our system off of. Our food system can't survive without exploiting having exploited labor, which is insane. Like, we need to figure out systems that can actually thrive while supporting, and paying living wages and treating people all right. But we're going to dive a lot deeper into all this stuff. I just think this is like the best food justice talk ever. You can find this on YouTube pretty easy too, if you want to share it. So from Paula, I know she talks about taking over your stoves, kitchens, etc. I have this I've been trying to get older elementary students to understand how seed saving and having ingredients to cook culturally relevant food connects to social justice. For sure. And we're going to talk a little bit about seed saving too today, and how that's like, we're losing that, because of the big ag seed companies are dominating right now. And their domination, I mean, a lot is based on eliminating things like seed saving, and then just like, I think it's just really important to understand the cultural relevant. It's about embracing cultures, and not assimilating. So yeah, really appreciate that. Thanks, Paula. Yeah, the pandemic is reminding us about the importance of knowing how to cook and use natural ingredients. For sure, I think even right now, we're going to talk a lot more about this and workers' rights and things, but I think this pandemic is also showing us just how all the workers in our food systems, I mean, we're only getting food right now because they're risking their lives getting this food, because they're sorry, because they're farm workers right now risking their lives to pick our crops and to bring the food here and then process it into the grocery stores. Like, if we learn anything from this pandemic, we need to realize just how much we rely on these people, and that these people deserve living wages and deserve benefits and protections and things like that. So hopefully we will learn all this through this crazy time. But okay, so last question. My husband is a health teacher in the PG County and teaches on food deserts there. Already shared the video with him. Awesome. Thank you all for the comments. Feel free to keep on commenting. But I'm going to move on because we got a lot to talk about. So we are get some water real quick. But So our next section is going to be talking about the history of our food system, starting, going back to colonial times and how it was really, created, and then how some of it was transformed, but a lot of it was preserved from the original systems. I think it's a great quote because we need to understand that a lot of these things that are wrong are actually, these systems are working how they're intended to be. They just weren't set up to be equal or fair. So we have to understand this when we approach these systems. So this is a great quote. Blaine Snipsall, he's an amazing food justice advocate, amazing writer. He writes a lot of really great articles for Why Hunger. He's part of this farm collective called the Black Dirt Farm Collective. He's just an all-around amazing advocate for a lot of great causes around food justice. But he wrote this. I definitely recommend reading the whole article. But wrote this. I'll read this quote: "The industrial food system, as we know it today, is a child of the plantation system of agriculture. They are both built upon exploited labor, disposition, and exploitation of land from indigenous peoples, the destruction of rural culture and land, consolidation of power and land in the ruling class, and the forced migration of peoples. The plantation system was the first major system used by colonial forces in their violent transformation of the earth into land, people, into property, and nature into the commodity, all to be sold on the fair market." So we really want to dive deeper into just this plantation system that we first started, like kind of the roots of our food system that can be founded in our colonial times. So we have to understand this plantation system. It was started, our colonization, America's colonization, started as capitalist ventures. They were tobacco corporations that were like sponsoring, first, Jamestown, his first colonies. With the specific purpose to become these plantations farming systems. And the plantation farming system is essentially it's a cash crop farming system. It's based on making as much money as possible. And there's and the way they do that is there's two very distinct ways they do that. One is they steal the land. They get free land from the native populations through ethnic cleansing, genocide, just all kinds of horrible things. And then the second part is they use exploited labor, whether that's free, just cheap labor, poor labor, and slave labor. But these two factors are what create the plantation system that makes it so profitable. And it's really important to understand that why these were, how a lot of European colonialism happened is because there was actually legal precedent for this stuff. And that comes with, there was a bunch of Catholic doctrines in the 1400s, the biggest one being the doctrine of discovery. And this was used as a legal precedent to do what they did, and because this doctrine basically gave European countries, white Christian countries, permission, legal right to go to non-Christian, non-white countries and basically conquer, destroy, pillage, ethnically cleanse, enslave populations. And we talk about this like, oh, this is like, happened a long time ago. It was in the past, but in reality, this is still the legal precedent that we use to justify not giving all of our land back to the Native Americans. Like they actually tried to sue in court in the 1800s. The Supreme Court said, because of the doctrine of discovery, we have legal right. U.S. government has legal right to this. So this is still legal precedent. It's still around today. It was used by Thomas Jefferson to expand westward. That was his legal precedent. To it's still what we use to deny proper reparations for Native Americans. And then, just to understand, we won't go too deeply, but I have a lot of classes on Native Americans. Just what happened is just, you can't even describe the horrors. Like, over 1.5 billion acres, millions of Native Americans lost their lives, and just opened up billions of acres for white plantation owners. So it's really good. Important to understand and to take the time to really realize what all that happened. But that provided the free land, and then the second step was the exploitation of workers. So they first used indentured servants. So if you read about like the rise of capitalism that really came about in like the 1500s in Europe, as like feudalism was falling apart. a lot due to the Black Plague, and that decreased the labor population, which gave them more, ability to revolt. They had more power, and then you could have a whole class on this one, but what actually happened is like from capitalism kind of rose and it created a lot of unequal systems and a lot of exploited labor and kind of continued, a different version of feudalism. So there was a lot of poor people in Europe at this time that were trying to, they're just looking to escape. So they would sign up, for these corporations, would sponsor their way over there, and then they'd have to work like 7 years, and then to pay off their debt, and then they would get a piece of land. So that worked out for a while, but I mean, a lot of people, they still were treated like, really close to, slavery. I mean, they were still treated really awfully. They were exploited. So a lot of them ran away. They revolted. So, and in 1619 was the 400-year anniversary just happened last year. There was all kinds of amazing things that was published, like the 1619 project. I'm blanking, but it was a really powerful article was written about that about 400-year anniversary last year. But that was the first time that Black people were brought to America. So there was question about where all of them were enslaved or some of them, but there was definitely some enslaved people. And when we talk about slaves, it was a new push to talk about not to just call them slaves, but call them enslaved people. They were actually people that were being enslaved. They weren't defined as slaves. So I'm gonna try to do that. I need to redo my slides too because this is a new thing for me. But just yeah, this is my intention, is to try to say enslaved people as much as possible instead of saying, and then not say slave owners, but or say, okay. So the idea is just okay. I'm not doing very good with time explaining that, but that's what I'm going to try to do. But we really need to understand like how slavery. We whitewash this history a lot. We talk about we teach in our schools about Thomas Jefferson writing about this was not a very good system. Free labor was better. It was all going to phase out on its own. We didn't. But in reality, that is just not true. This was a very profitable system that ran off. We perfected the art of torture, and that where we systematically torture these people to just produce as much profit as possible. And even in the North, after the North freed their enslaved people, they stole all the profits that they made from their production was from raw material picked by enslaved people. The Industrial Revolution, in Europe and all over, it was the main product was textiles, and like 80-90% of that was picked by enslaved people. Like every aspect of our economy, benefited, and entire Western Europe was modern work was built on the backs of enslaved people, and seeing trillions of dollars we're talking about. And we talk about, oh, this is just a rich thing, only rich, but this is a really great book I just recently read, that half has never been told. Oh, thank you for explaining. So it was a great comment. So thank you. We are all learning to use that term enslaved. People were not born slaves. They were people first who were enslaved. Thank you. That's what I was trying to say. I'm just, oh man, my brain is fried right now. But thank you so much for adding to that. So if everyone just, it's going to take a while for us to adapt, but just try to incorporate that because there is power in language. But I really recommend reading this book. The Half Has Never Been Told. There's a lot of great books, but we don't really teach. We teach like some realities, but not the real reality of what happened during the 250 years of slavery. And this is really great. We talked about how, like, especially when we start opening it up, taking native land out west and start opening it up. The first mortgages were slave mortgages, where a poor white person could go to a federally backed bank, get a mortgage, get a loan to buy not only land but slaves, and like it was just like banking, all different kinds of institutions. They just made, you can't underestimate how much, profit was made from this system, that we really downplay that history. And on top of that, it created a lot of our social structures in our country. And one of the biggest ones was the racial bribe. So this is basically, the idea is, so you had enslaved people and you had indentured servants, working side by side, and eventually, they realized they were both exploited, and they started revolting, in the mid, 1600s. The biggest one being Bacon's Rebellion. They actually burnt down Jamestown. to be clear, though, I mean, they were angry because they wanted to actually take over more native land, and so it wasn't like this most noble cause. But at the same time, it was like it was upsetting the hierarchy of this aristocracy in colonial times. So the government kind of freaked out. So what they did is they created a bunch of series called slave codes, where they that's when they made slavery a hereditary thing for Black people, and created all these oppressive laws around Black people. And at the same time, they gave all these benefits to white people. And this is the first time we really see the emergence of this idea of white people. Before this time, the people were called Europeans. They were called by different countries. They specifically started codifying their laws and using the words white. It was very intentional with the idea of creating this racial divide where instead of like poor white people and poor Black people uniting against rich white people, now they're creating this divide where poor white people were deciding to stay on and unite with rich white people with a racial divide against Black people. So we start seeing, and then that's when we see a lot of stereotypes and a lot of bad things, just like a lot of Black stereotypes, and just trying demonizing them and trying to create this a rift, and that we still see today. That came about as what we call the racial pride of like the colonial governments trying to figure out ways to divide workers, poor workers, but even after slavery ended, though, they were still, the system itself ended, but in many ways it continued. In many ways, even worse than how it was before. One of the main ways was sharecropping. So even after the Civil War, they suddenly had all these plantations and these food systems that could only survive by continuing to exploit labor. So it wasn't like. One option was they could have rebuilt everything in different systems, but instead they decided to figure out new systems to kind of continue to, have that exploited labor. And one of the ways that they did was sharecropping, where one, they made it really hard for Black people to buy their own land. So they had to rent land out from basically the previous plantations that decades earlier they were enslaved on, and now they were, renting out a piece of land from these previous owners. And how you have to pay up front, or you have to take these loans against renting the land, against equipment, seeds, all that stuff. And the idea is you take your food to the market, and then you pay off their loans, and you should have some left over. But in reality, they very seldom were they able to actually pay off their loans. And this created what we call debt peonage, where you just go further and further in debt and basically create a whole new level of slavery. But unfortunately, that was one that because the South passed all these Black codes where restricting Black people from working in any other field, so they had to work in sharecropping, or if they were caught with not a sharecropping law, there was always vagrancy laws where if you were caught without a job, or there's always Black codes where if you were walking on the wrong side of the street or looking at a white woman, or all these different like random things, where they're essentially criminalizing Black lives, and then they would arrest you, send you into prison, and then they created what was called a convict leasing system, where they would lease out Black convicts to plantations and to mines and things like that. And this was, I've read stories about how this people have made claims that this actually killed more Black people than entire slavery, which I don't know. I mean, it's tough, but you have to understand just how brutal the system was. In slave times, you invested to enslave people because you wanted them to work as long as possible. But with convict leasing, I mean, you're getting a new batch of prisoners every month. So I mean, you could just work them to death and then just get new ones. And it was a really horrific system. So people were, Black people were stuck between, getting a job at sharecropping, or if they didn't, they could get arrested for some, weird, Black code or vagrancy laws, and then get stuck in convict leasing, or they could try to escape. And we really whitewashed this escape out. We call it the Great Migration, where 5 million Black people, migrated out of the South. In reality, they were internal refugees escaping, horrific terrorism, horrible Jim Crow laws, and just no opportunity. So there wasn't a whole lot of options for them. and convict leasing. Eventually, we outlawed convict leasing in the early 1920s and 30s, mainly because it competed too much against free labor, free white labor. So we got rid of that system. But unfortunately, we brought it back in the 1970s with this organization called ALEC. I think it's like American Legislation Something's Council, ALEC, but in the 70s they lobbied to loosen a lot of these rules and bring back, these private system prison systems, and that's really what we have today because of their lobbying effort. We have all these prison systems that use private labor and pay next to nothing for that labor, and that in the same time they were doing that, they were also pushing these really draconian criminal justice laws like 3 strikes, and like all these different laws that eventually created the war on drugs and the mass, and the rise of mass incarceration. And so you have to understand that all of this is kind of tied together, and it's all there to just make an enormous amount of profit from our food systems and our plantation systems. So and then but as a lot, we're going to talk about a lot of black people were farmers for early 1900s, but then they started they lost a lot of land. We'll talk about that in a second. So we needed more farmers. So around the 1860s, but really about 1900s, we started looking towards immigrants, Asian immigrants in the West, Mexican immigrants in the South, and then eventually Latin American immigrants, to continue these systems. But the thing is like we never actually changed. This system has always required exploited labor. We've never actually try to change that. It's always been exploited labor. So that's a really important thing to understand, that this system is based on the initial plantation system. It's changed, and then we changed different things, but we're still today keeping people in basic slavery situations in order to pick our food. So we have to understand like the history of this system. So now these private systems are now the new sweatshops. Yeah. Um, all right. So next, I want to talk about black land. So what's super important to our food systems and to our country in general is land ownership. So there was a Union general called General Sherman. He did this, it's called the March to the Sea, where he went behind the Confederate lines and just like wreaked havoc and just burned, down their supply lines and plantations and stuff. And then, but he freed a lot of black people from slavery, and a lot of them followed his march, and followed this army trying to help out when they can. So he met with a lot of these leaders, and he was like, what do you need after the war to be able to survive? And all of them are like, we need land. Like, we need to be able to grow our own crops. We need to have control over our food. We need land. And that's really what created this, his first field order, or his special field orders number 15, which is basically 40 acres and a mule. This idea that we would give freed slaves or freed enslaved people 40 acres. And then eventually a government surplus, a military surplus mule. And that actually happened for a lot of freed people. 40,000 people got land. They were, captured land from Confederate plantations. Unfortunately, when Lincoln died, President Johnson, who was much more of a friend to Confederates, he allowed a lot of Confederates to come back in power. So during the Reconstruction period. But he overturned that and took back most of the land. A couple people were able to keep their land because somehow they're able to produce, get a deed on that land. But most of them, didn't have deeds and had to return that. That was mainly in like the South Carolina coastal area. But there was a Freedmen Bureau that was built, designated to try to help a lot of freed people after the Civil War, and they really pushed for having giving every freed slave or enslaved person 40 acres, and they tried to pass legislation. Unfortunately, that did not work. But that was really like the first real and only real attempt to try to bring some kind of reparations and try to fix, what happened during the 250 years slavery. And unfortunately, it did not work out. But someone had estimated if it had gotten that land, that would be worth about $6.5 trillion today. So you just think about how much value and and you look at the racial wealth gap and just how much more money wealth that the white people have compared to black people, and you can start seeing like things like this is one of the reasons why that the racial wealth gap was produced. But despite all of this, despite Jim Crow, despite all the things that were happening in the South, black people were still able to accumulate in about half a century were able to accumulate about 15 million acres, and they of land, and that was almost all of it was farmland, and they had like 14% of the farms were black, and they had almost 1 million black farmers, which is a huge portion of farming in the early 1900s. But over the last century, we've just seen this massive loss of land through a lot of shady practices that we'll talk about in a second. But we saw around 90% of those 15 million acres were stolen. 600,000 black farmers were pushed off their land. And now today we're looking at, black farmers make up about 2%, or only about 45,000 black farmers are still left. And a lot of people say, well, that's because it got mechanized and all these different things. But if you look at the charts during that time, this is the red line is white farmers, and the green line is black farmers. You can see that these trends only affected black farmers. So we have to understand that just the impact of this black land loss, and this occurred through a bunch of different ways. From one of them was deceit. So a lot of black people, it was against the law to educate enslaved people on how to read and write. So after the Civil War, there was a lot of black people that couldn't read and write. So that meant there was a lot of local white governments that took advantage of that. Made up fines, made up different things. And this was during Jim Crow, where black people, it was very hard to find a lawyer to represent themselves, or if they could afford one. And what happened is they just got swindled out of a lot of land. A lot of this was white terrorism. A lot of like the KKK, a lot of lynchings happened in order to, they kill people in order to take their land over. A lot of this was USDA racial discrimination. The USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, was created to kind of support and help farms farming, but they had all these things from loans to credits to like insurances, in case you had crop failures, to the disaster relief funds if you got flooded. But for most of the century, they only used those funds for white farmers, and they actually had to settle in multiple, 2 cases, the Big Four cases, and they settled for billions in loss from all the horrible things that USDA had done. But I mean, even with billions, you break it down, it was like still like $20,000-$30,000 reparations for losing, like a 50-acre farm, which is, so it still did not, repair the damage. The biggest way, and this is still going today, the biggest way black people lose their land is called heirs property, and through partition sales. So heirs property was created so if you don't have a will, and this is why it's so important for everyone to go out and get wills. But if you don't have a will and you die, all your property and things go to your heirs. So they're divided evenly among your heirs by the state. So a lot of black people, in those 15 million acres, they couldn't read or write, they couldn't get a lawyer, so they didn't have will. So when they passed away, their property would be divided, the ownership would be divided among all their heirs. But the problem with that heirs property is because it's divided, you can't get a clear deed to the property. And without a deed, you can't get mortgages, you can't get home improvement loans, you can't even get disaster relief, so like when Katrina hit New Orleans, there were so many people that didn't have deeds because the heirs property, and they didn't get anything from FEMA. So it's a really awful way, to keep these people in poverty. And at the same time, like a lot of the land, we talked about a lot of this land that they got was at the time they were able to get because it wasn't very good farmland, like a lot of coastal land. But in the 50s and 60s, in the South, there was a huge tourism boom. So a lot of developers were suddenly interested in this coastal land. So they started, so what they would do with the heirs properties, they would research these people, find some distant heir, maybe lived in another state, maybe didn't even know he had a claim in this property. And they go and, find them and then, throw some money at them and they would buy his portion or her portion. And then if you have a portion of it, if you're one of the heirs, you can force what's called a partition sale. And the partition sale is basically like, the reason why they have it is because my understanding is if if you divide all this stuff and there's only one person, one heir actually, working on the farm, he needs to have a deed, or she needs to have a deed, so he can force everyone else to sell all the property and he could bid on it, in theory. But in reality, like what would happen is they would would buy some distant relative. They would find out he had a connection. They would buy his property or his connection, and then force a partition sale, and then outbid everyone on that land, and then take it over. And you can really see like ground zero for this is Hilton Head, South Carolina. I'm from Ohio. Everyone in Ohio went to Hilton Head for the summer vacations. We went years, and it's crazy to think about. Like in Hilton Head, up until the 40s and 50s was like completely black owned, and now it's almost completely like white owned by developers and resorts and stuff. And a lot of that was through this shady practice of forcing partition sales. So this is like how millions of black people's land was lost, and it's still being lost. I mean, there's a lot of states that have done reforms right now with heirs property, but a lot of them haven't, and then they're resistant to these reforms. So this is still a practice that's happening today. In the last part, property tax I can never say this word, delinquency, and that's basically a big practice that would happen a lot of times. Thurgood Marshall wrote a lot about this. The local government, they wanted a black farm, they would just raise the property value, and that would raise the taxes, and then they couldn't afford it, and they would fall behind, and then the state would take over that land. So you have to understand, through these practices, millions and millions of acres of black farmland was taken from them through all of this. And at the same time that all this was happening, there was giant, giveaways to white people from native lands. From the Indian Removal Act, that's when all the southern tribes were removed. That was 25 million acres. All of that was given. That was like when a lot of the slave mortgages got big, because they had all this extra land, and any white person could just get a government-backed loan to buy some of that land and buy some slaves, and start a plantation on there. So it was. Said Act, that was 270 million acres of native territory that was that was given to white people only. The Dawes Act, that was when we forced a lot of Native Americans at that time were living on living on reservations, but they were living in communal areas, and so they forced them to go to live on small plots, and then there was a lot of extra communal land, 90 million acres when we did that, and that was given to, or sold really cheaply to white settlers. So I'm going to play a real quick clip of MLK, Martin Luther King, talking a little bit about this. This is a couple weeks before he was launching a Poor People's Campaign for economic reparations, and it was a couple weeks before he was assassinated. And we really do a bad job teaching about Martin Luther King in our schools. Like, we teach it very whitewashed. Like, he had a dream, and supposedly that dream came in reality. We had civil rights bills, and we fixed racism in the 60s. In reality, those civil rights bills, they were great, but they did not, they didn't repair past harm. They they outlawed Jim Crow, but allowed a lot of de facto, segregation and white supremacy and things to continue, housing discrimination and things. So they were great, but they didn't, we sell this idea that we fixed racism and back then, but that's, very far from the case. In fact, Martin Luther King later, gave an interview where he said that his dream actually turned out to be a nightmare. He realized that he was naive, that what we really needed was economic reparations and economic justice. And so that's when he started his Poor People's Campaign, which is still happening. There's still one that's scheduled for the summer. The Reverend Barber from North Carolina, the moral, right? I can't. I'm going to get it wrong, but I mean, this is still happening. It's still a very powerful campaign. But I'm going to play the speech really quickly, and then after the speech, Kathleen Carver, a leader in the Black Panther movement, gives a little bit of commentary.
Very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farm. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Wait a minute. It didn't disappear. You might forget Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. The Poor People's Campaign was supposed to go to Washington in April. So the organization that mobilized it was essentially decapitated and thrown into chaos about 3 weeks before it was supposed to happen. Those organizations were being, as I said, once the Civil Rights Acts were completed, that was it. Government was through with us. They're not interested in restructuring. There has never been any interest in restructuring the economy for the benefit of the poor. I don't know where you're going to talk about the bonus army. Go back to Shays' Rebellion. I mean, this is like the no-no. You know, this is a capitalist society. It's built on inequality and avarice in many ways.
Right. And the last thing I want to say about this, before we move on to another section, is just like it's important to understand. Like I think a lot of times people that don't understand like our real history, like, they come into these communities and be like, oh, you just got to go back and grow your own food, go back to soil, everything's gonna be great, and they don't understand the level of trauma that a lot of Black communities have, and not just Black communities, but other communities, but particularly Black communities have around farming, from the convict leasing, the sharecropping, the slavery, and we were learning, this is a new science, but we're learning a lot of, when you experience, it's called epigenetics, when you experience a lot of trauma, you can actually do some damage to your genetic code, and then you could pass that genetic code and that trauma to your children and generations and generations. So it's not just like, oh, this happened a long time ago. This is something that's very present in people's lives. And I think there's a really great quote. Leah Penniman, she runs the Soulfire Farm in New York, a great food justice advocate, made a really great book called Farming While Black. I definitely recommend reading. She said, there's a danger in confusing the impression that our people experience on land with the spirit of the land itself. And I think about, there's a really great organization, we'll talk more about this later, called Soilful City in DC, managed by Xavier Brown. And his main mission is just to kind of heal a lot of his intergenerational trauma, and get people to see farming and growing as a way to actually heal, and instead of like as opposed to something that actually causes harm. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow, though. So we talked about that. So this whole backdrop of this exploited labor and land theft and all these things. Amidst this backdrop, all of a sudden in the mid 20th century, we have this rise of this industrial agricultural system. And so this really started in like 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it really kicked off after the World War II, when we were just super excited about technology and its ability to save the world. We were really concerned about the growing population, and we were going to be able to feed this. Some people claim that was over exaggerated, but that there were some serious issues about feeding people, and then also how to maintain profitability for a lot of these large agricultural systems. So that we launched over a period of decades this movement called the Rise of Industrial Agriculture. Some people call it the Green Revolution. It was just this huge rise of large-scale monocultural systems, really based on that plantation system of just mass producing as much food as profitable as possible, enough as much profit at the cost of like workers' rights and animal welfare, and just destroying the environment and individual community health and small farms, and just like processing our food and killing the environment and things like that. And at the same time, we saw this consolidation of food systems, where instead of just having our food system having all these small scale farms, we start seeing these large monopoly farms starting to emerge. So there's only 4% of farms actually make over $1 million or a large scale, but they can control, the majority of all, sales that happen in this country. So these handful of companies are just, are starting to control majority of our food systems right now. And not only with our food systems, but also with our seed productions. 5 companies control the majority of our seeds and our pesticides and fertilizers and things like that, which we'll talk a little bit more about them and with GMOs and stuff later in the presentation. And it's really important. I want to mention too, this is particularly bad with chicken farms, because a lot of there's a really great documentary called Contracted, where how mostly like Tyson's and all them, how a lot of their they do with their chicken farms is they do what's like very similar to sharecropping, where they'll give loans and have people start their own chicken farms, but then most people can never pay back those loans and just get further and further in debt, and it's just a crazy situation. And it's, on top of that, we start seeing this rise of the supermarkets and processed food, and you start seeing this loss of local community self-reliance. And we're going to talk a lot about that tomorrow or in the next class. Particularly how that played out in DC, east of the river as well. But in the 30s, we saw all of a sudden. We used to have all these like local community grocery stores and markets and stuff, and then in the 30s, we start seeing these big supermarkets like Safeways and Giants, and they're getting all this cheap food from from these big aggregators and from processed foods and stuff. And we start seeing in the 50s, we start making TV dinners and figuring out all these ways to process food to make it almost not like food, and it just blows up and takes over the market, and we see communities they lose those small local self-reliant stores, and they're just more at the mercy of a lot of these stores, and then that gets caught up in things like white flight and deindustrialization and urban environments, and then you start seeing these grocery stores leave these communities without much of an option anymore for food. But we're going to talk a lot about that in the next class. And on top of that, Donna mentioned about farm bills, and a lot of times people look towards farm bills to make that change in our food systems, but it's really tough. Farm bills came about during the Great Depression as a way to kind of support farmers. It's renewed every 5 years. It has things like crop insurance and funding for farms. And one big thing it does is it funds a lot of farm research and a lot of and so it can decide, do I want to fund industrial agriculture, or do I want to fund sustainable agriculture? So it's a big fight every 5 years, and that can really push us in different directions in our food systems. But on top of that, a big proportion of this farm bill that just came about, I believe in I can't remember, like the 80s or 90s. I think it was when Clinton reformed the welfare system. I think that's when it got attached. But so SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or what we call food stamps. So that's tied to now the Farm Bill, and it becomes this major debate point and attack from. And unfortunately, a big way they attack this is they try to combine. They try to combine work requirements to this with the idea it's like, oh yeah, no free handouts, everyone has to work, which I guess in theory from some sounds great, but like the problem is very disproportionately affects minorities, because a lot of times there's these exception zones. There's exceptions for high employment areas, and those are almost always white and rural areas because there's lower populations. But in urban areas where there's higher populations, even though there's more people in need, the unemployment rate is lowered by just the pure volume of people. So it doesn't play out very well. It also doesn't take in the fact that racial discrimination in our job markets and how much harder it is for a lot to get jobs. So it's not a good thing at all. All right, so now we talk, we talked about industrial food systems and different histories of it. Now we're going to kind of dive into the workers that make up our food systems. And as I was saying, this is a time, if ever, to really understand just how reliant we are and how these people are literally saving our lives right now, and how horrible that our systems treat these people right now. And so hopefully after this pandemic, this will be a good indicator if we actually learn something or not, is if we can actually start paying these people livable wages and protections and things. But So with farm workers, it's really important to understand. In FDR's New Deal, he had all kinds of great labor rights and like for like the right to form labor unions, minimum wages, overtime, workers, child labor laws. It was really powerful stuff. But you have to understand the climate at the time. So there. It's really unfortunate we don't teach much about the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction was like this decade-long period after the Civil War. It started out really awfully because Andrew Johnson, took over. But then there's these people called radical Republicans, which are very opposite. They're very progressive people. It's kind of the Republican Party kind of took a switch, and Democrats in the 50s and 60s around desegregation and civil rights. But during that time, the Republican Party was it was a radical Republicans. I mean, these are the people that created like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Outlawing slavery, making Black people citizens, giving them equal protection and right to vote. So I mean, they were amazing people. Very, so they had a period of like 5 or 6 years where they did a lot of great work. They built a lot of schools. They helped a lot of people in the South. But then but it was enforced by the military. So it was very expensive. And eventually people in the North and the government just lost they just didn't care anymore, which is so tragic. And they kind of let the old Confederate governments just like retake, through like terrorism and voter suppression, kind of retake the South. And then for a whole century, the South was called the Southern Bloc. It's like the Dixiecrats, where they just opposed any kind of anything that had to do with desegregation or civil rights. So in order for FDR to pass things, that it was really needed during the Depression, he had to find clever ways to exclude people of color. And we'll talk more about that, how he did that with like home loans and things like that. But just for now, we'll talk about that in the next class. But for now, we're just going to talk about how he figured out how to exclude people from a lot of these labor rights. And he looked at the two industries. And I don't know if he personally did it or whoever did it, but they looked at the two industries that had the most people of color, farm workers and domestic workers, and then they excluded those industries from these labor protections. So that's why a lot of these people in these industries just don't have a whole lot of protections. And so we start seeing these different waves of immigrant workers kind of taking over, especially as like Black people start leaving the farming, either on their own or having their land taken away. We start there's this huge need to bring more exploited labor and to keep this food system going. So we really see the first one is like in the West Coast. We start seeing this influx of Asian immigrants, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. And we really don't talk much about the history of this, but those people were treated so awful. They had no rights. They couldn't own land. They couldn't represent themselves in court. A lot of them were lynched. A lot of them experienced enormous amount of violence. It was and then they were scapegoated repeatedly. Lots of like really horrific, caricatures and just blaming, any kind of like economic downturn on these Chinese. And eventually they were, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned, immigrants from, coming from China and in Asia with like the Asiatic barred zone. And this really, they banned, immigrants. Up until 1965 with the Immigration Act. So majority of and it was a really, really awful time for a lot of these Asian Americans. But eventually, particularly like the Filipino workers started to organize on a lot of these farms. And that really, when he brought, it was like kind of foundations of the United Farm Workers, like Doris Horton and Cesar Chavez. It was really cool organizing, but at the same time, it drew a lot of these large scale farms to start looking for other labor sources, and that's when they turned to Mexican farmers. So like Mexico, after the Mexican American War, when we took over a lot of Mexico. A lot of people, Texas and California, all that used to be Mexico. But we took that over with the war, and then a lot of people stayed and became citizens. But also at the same time, the borders weren't really enforced. There was a lot more people going back and forth when you look for work. So we had a lot of programs that brought more in, because we had labor shortages. And we see this pattern of emerge where we have labor shortages. We need exploited labor to keep the system going. So we bring in immigrants, we exploit them, and then something will happen, like a recession, a depression, or some opportunistic racist, politician that wants to, rise, by exploiting and scapegoating immigrants, and then we see these horrible acts happening, like for example, the Mexican reparations. Repatriation, they were basically blamed for the Great Recession or Great Depression, mass deported. It doesn't matter if they were U.S. citizens or not, just millions of workers were deported violently. Many people died. But then, World War II starts happening. We suddenly have a labor shortage again. All these farm workers are going to war. So then we start the Barsario program, where we recruit Mexican workers back to the farms, to work in these horrible conditions. But then the soldiers, when war ended, the soldiers were coming back home, and they were having a hard time finding jobs. So then that's when we did the same thing again. And I got some feedback on this, so I'm not going to actually mention this word, because I'm just going to call it Operation W. Someone told me that it is a very derogatory word, but I got some feedback on the last class that he felt like it was basically saying Operation N-word, and that is a testimony just that how racist these operations were. These weren't, enforcing the law or things like that. These were purely racist operations. And this one was one of the worst ones. It was done by Eisenhower, and it was so bad because it was done so quickly, and over 1 million Mexican migrant workers, a lot of them U.S. citizens, deported under horrible conditions, and a lot of people died on that. So it's just awful. But then again, we have labor shortages again. I mean, white people don't want to work on farms because it's a really a hard job. So then we start in the 70s, we start recruiting again from Mexico and from Central America. A lot of this came from because a lot of people it came because there was an enormous amount of people trying to escape Central America from a lot of wars that we had heavy hand in, from Guatemala Civil War, Honduras, El Salvador. So a lot of that, and at the same time, a lot of free trade agreements that we started, like NAFTA. NAFTA removed tariffs, and so we were able to dump this heavily subsidized American corn onto Mexico's economy, and just like millions of Mexican farmers, couldn't compete with that heavily subsidized corn, and they all lost their farms, and then so they became migrants looking for work. So it's really important, important that we understand like how this works. It's a pattern, and we're seeing that same pattern play out right now with the Trump administration trying to use, blame all of our problems on immigrants. It's just a history that keeps on repeating. So really understanding farm workers today. So it's really important to understand that the majority of our farm workers are undocumented workers, and I think it's important to understand that, because it's also important that just how horrific it is that we rely on these people to literally feed us, and yet we treat them so horribly. So it's just an awful situation. And then about a quarter of them are U.S. citizens, and then another quarter are what we call lawful immigrants, or they do these guest worker programs, temporary worker programs, and these are terrible programs, because at least when you're a migrant worker on your own, you can move around the farms if abuse happens. These people cannot leave their farms, and they have to tolerate any kind of abuse that's given to them. And you just look at some of the stats. I won't go on all of them, but they're making like $15,000 to $17,000 a year. It's one of the most dangerous occupations, full of harassment, abuse, pesticides exposures, all kinds of health conditions. A lot of times they have to bring their families and live in just awful migrant camps, because a lot of migrant workers, they're traveling, they're not just going to one farm, they're traveling by season to different farms throughout the country to try to pick, on different harvest seasons. And it's just a terrible situation. Most of them don't have health insurance. They can't, and now they can't even go to the hospital because they're worried. Hospitals used to be these safe zones. Like Obama, definitely deported a lot of people. Like, he was not innocent on the deportation, but a lot of it, he stayed away from, farm workers and hospitals and schools. And what we're seeing is there's no safe zone right now for a lot of these people. So it's a pretty tough situation. On top of that too, we're not just talking about food workers, but we're also talking about food processing plants. So a lot of these, the early, a lot of these arose, these like meat processing, meat packing plants rose in the Industrial Revolution in the 1900s. And when they started, they're just awful, awful situations. Up in Sinclair wrote, the jungle, exposing all these horrific conditions, and which caused, a lot of federal oversight and regulations, and it actually improved. And these were actually decent jobs for a while. But in the 1980s, when they started consolidating, big companies started taking over. They started working with governments to deregulate workers' rights and breaking up unions, increasing speeds. We're seeing them go back to how they originally were. And at that time, a lot of people, they were used to these good conditions, so they started unionizing and trying to fight back. So that drove a lot of these plants to start looking for undocumented immigrant labor. So a lot of them, like BC Rogers, he runs the Koch Foods, not to be confused with Koch brothers. It's a different organization, but to avoid a lot of black workers unionizing, he created all these programs to bring over a lot of Mexican workers and Latino workers to Mississippi to run a lot of chicken processing plants, like tens of thousands. And then he would even set up awful living conditions, but we would help them with living conditions. They still had to pay for it. But then we see, like, eventually, they're treated so horribly, a lot of wage theft, a lot of like harassment, things like that, that they start fighting back, and they start organizing. And in 2018, they actually win some cases with the EEOC against sexual harassment and wage theft. And then less than a year after they won their cases, all of a sudden, if you remember in Mississippi last year, those massive ICE raids on the poultry plants, these were the people, one of them was like some 680 immigrant women, mostly mothers, that were reported. And there was no consequences, for the corporation that brought them over and paid for all that stuff. They're fine. It's all, it's just like a testimony to how much we use these people and exploit them, and then use them as a political scapegoat when they try to rise up. So it's really important to understand that. But one thing I want to talk about is this myth that undocumented workers actually take more than they give, that they actually are drained on society, and that is just so wrong in so many ways. And it's really important to understand that not only is our entire food system surviving on undocumented workers, but at the same time they're making an enormous amount of wealth for like California and different agricultural states that could not operate without these workers. And at the same time, they're paying. There's this, like, IRS has this thing, this income tax thing for people that don't have social security numbers, where it's all voluntary, but you can voluntarily pay federal taxes, and millions of undocumented workers every year on their own sign up for this and pay federal taxes. It's like billions of dollars of federal taxes every year that we get from that program, and not including like sales and property taxes and payrolls. They estimate in the last decade, undocumented workers have contributed $100 billion to our Social Security program, a program they cannot even access. Like it's crazy to think about that. And then they blame them when they get blamed for taking jobs. So United Fruit the United Fruit Organization, the Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huertas. Sorry, I'm having trouble speaking right now. So their organization actually did this thing in 2010 during the Great Recession. They launched this program to see any person could just come out and work on the farm, like trying to challenge this idea that they were creating taking away jobs, and like they couldn't get anyone. They got like 12 people to show up, white people to show up, and they didn't last a day. So it's just they use these people as a political scapegoat, basically. And I think the biggest thing that we need to understand too is so there's this thing called political dog whistles or racial dog whistles. It started with like George Wallace and Barry Goldwater and Nixon, and they realized that it's just not socially acceptable. And some places it still is, but most places not socially acceptable to just like say the N-word and say these people are inferior. So instead they come up with these nice sounding things and that like states' rights, and I just care about law and order, and I just care about. But in reality, they use these things to kind of cover up the fact that they're pushing really oppressive agendas. A big one is like calling these people illegals. We have to get away from that. They are not. It's not. You're not a criminal for crossing the border, or most of these people are just overstaying visas. These are civil defenses, like no different than like jaywalking and things like that. But we use these terms like illegal so we can criminalize these people, and then pass more oppressive, agendas and policies. So it's really important to kind of get away from that, that kind of saying and language. And then the last thing I want to just talk about, there's a really great article Michael Greenberg wrote in the Valley of Fear of just like what it means to live under, be an undocumented immigrant, working on, under a Trump administration. Just the fact that, Obama still deported people, he was not innocent, but he left farm workers alone. He left people in hospitals alone and people dropping off their kids. And that is just like, now it's just this constant state of terror that they're living in. They give trainings to their kids about what to do when their parents don't come home. And oh, sorry about that. So it's just I'll let you guys read this on your own, but it's just we just really need to understand what is happening to these people right now. But there is some, there is some really great farm worker rights campaigns. They're actually making a lot of headway and bringing a lot of like workers' rights and pay, increased pay to migrant workers. Probably the most important, the most successful one by far is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. So they have a program called Fair Food Program. So these are Florida tomato migrant workers, farm workers, and they were experiencing all kinds of like harassment and wage theft. So they created this program in the early 2000s called the Fair Food Program, where they essentially they went to the big buyers of these tomatoes, like the Walmarts and Chipotle's, and they said they asked them to sign on to this program, basically agreeing that if there's any abuse in any of these farms, any wage theft, anything like that, that they'll stop buying from those farms. And at the same time, they agreed to pay an extra premium, which is just a couple cents a pound, but it actually adds up a lot. And that premium has to go to the farm workers. And they've been like, and it took a while. I mean, over the last decade, they've been doing campaigns against all these international companies from Trader Joe's, Subway, and some of them, were on board, and some of them, it took a while of protesting. And then they would do a lot of college campus boycotts and things like that. But they got all these companies are on board, and that's like allowing them to live in much better environments. They have protections now. They're getting paid better. There are two holdouts, Wendy's and Publix. Publix is like a southern grocery store, are refusing to still sign. So if you do drive by Wendy's and you see people picketing, that's the reason why. We actually have a local chapter called the DC Fair Food that organizes. So if you want to get involved with this, definitely go, reach out to them and figure out how you can help try to get Wendy's on board. And then I'm going to talk about a couple successful campaigns really quickly, just to show you that these things do work. Like in Vermont, dairy farms, where like Ben and Jerry's and big, other big ice cream and dairy organizations get most of their milk. There was really, it was all migrant workers that was just treated really awfully. So they ran similar to Fair Foods. They had a Milk with Dignity code of conduct, and they got, they worked, instead of working with the farmers, they worked on the people buying the stuff, and they got eventually, Ben and Jerry's fought this for a while, but they got Ben and Jerry to agree to sign on board, saying they won't buy milk from any company that doesn't support all these great issues for farmers. And same thing with Driscoll. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, there was a Driscoll berry boycott. Similar situation, migrant workers dealing with bad situations. They wanted to actually unionize. And that's like the golden, that's what the ultimate goal you want to go towards, not just these little concessions, but if you can have a union, that gives you power to fight, oppression indefinitely. It's a very powerful tool. And they eventually, after a couple of years of boycotting, they got them to agree to give them a union, and within like a month, that union was able to negotiate, $15 an hour and increase living wages and all different kinds of stuff. So there's but there's still some farms in Mexico. It's like on and off. It's really hard to get some kind of clear messaging what's happening down there. But it's occasionally the boycott may go back on or may not. It's just something to be aware of. And then there's some international campaigns to be aware of. A big one is shrimp from Thailand, and so there's all these recent reports and investigative journalism from the Guardian and different other organizations that found that there's an enormous amount of slave labor or enslaved people in the Thailand shrimp industry. So a lot of times they'll capture these people on boats and force them to work on boats or force them to work in sweatshops, so, you know, peeling shrimp and things like that. And so it's a terrible industry. So it's important to try to find, you know, alternatives to that to Thailand shrimp. You know, looking for, you know, there's like a lot of great certification programs like the aquaculture stewardship program that talks about, you know, so if you see this certification, you know that this is ethically sourced. There's a lot of, you know, Montgomery Bay, we'll talk about them in a while, but their aquarium, they have a seafood slavery tool that helps you analyze and find, you know, shrimp that was not picked from industries that have slave labor or enslaved people, slave labor. So Greenpeace has a scorecard and things like that. But the biggest one is just trying to find, you know, support local shrimping industries. We have some really fantastic shrimping industries in the Gulf and in Alaska. So if you ask about it, normally it should be labeled as Gulf shrimp. It's not always. Some people just use that name, but it's important to just ask if you want to buy some shrimp. You know, ask your waiter, your waitress. You know, where does this shrimp come from? If they don't know, then I guarantee it's from Thailand because that's just it's super cheap, you know. But if you know, if they can tell you where it's from, I mean that's a much better source. And then, so Brazil, talking about coffee, Brazil is the leading exporter of coffee, and it's where a lot of Nestle, you know, products, you know, Nescafe and stuff get their coffee. And then there's a lot of abuse in that coffee systems, a lot of debt peonage, a lot of like just horrible conditions and working conditions. So one way to kind of counter that is just to find some more ethical coffee options. And there's a couple different great options right now. Fair Trade, this is probably the one that people are most familiar with. It's a really great organization. I mean, it started a long time ago, but I mean, I think the actual organization, you know, was like in the 1980s or so. But the idea is that there's a third-party certification group where they only work with cooperatives, you know, so farmers that you maybe community farmers that all, you know, organize around a big communal cooperative. So they'll work with them, and in order to get the certification, you have to, like, you know, demonstrate that you treat your employees well, and that you have good environmental rights and things like that, or environmental protections. So that works out, you know, and at the same time, there's a little, you pay a little bit more for fair trade because there's a premium that goes back to that cooperative, and it doesn't get lost between the middle people. There's a lot of great options. There are a little bit of, I mean, there's some issues right now with fair trade that they're dealing with, like, you know, the fees, or just like making sure all the money gets back to them and stuff. So they're working on some issues. It's not a perfect system, but I think overall it's a really fantastic option. And if you see fair trade for anything, I would recommend supporting it. But then there's a new thing called direct trade that is really just getting its start in the last like decade or so. So the idea is like these like a coffee shop would work directly with a local coffee farmer, and then so they remove all the people in the middle, which, you know, means more money goes back to these farms. But they really operate on what's called specialty coffee. So they're not. The thing about fair trade is there's no certification for quality. So a lot of times it's just like normal quality or not the best coffee. But specialty coffee, though, that is like that's really high-end coffee. So that's like you gotta get people to hand pick your coffee. They're only picking the best beans. It takes more labor. It's more, you know. But what's great about specialty coffee is you get like 3 or 4 times the amount of money for it. So there's a lot more money going back to these farmers. They're getting a lot more money for specialty coffee than they would for fair trade. But the thing is, you have to kind of research each company, because it's up to the company to do to be responsible and to set up systems that actually, you know, have accountability. So it really it's important to do your research. But there's a really great company in DC. It's called Counterculture Coffee. I don't think they're originally from DC, but they have a shop in DC. They're real awesome. They host coffee tastings, free coffee tastings. So when COVID's over, reach out to them. You could try. And I always thought like coffee's coffee. Like I don't, you know, taste the difference. But I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, it's amazing coffee. But then they also give presentations, and they talk about their, you know, all the things they do to ensure accountability, and all the things they do to bring more money to the farmers. And it's a really cool experience if you have a second. And then the last thing is about shade-grown coffee. So, so most coffee grew up in shade, like it was started in shade in Ethiopia. It grows under like forest, and when you do it that way, it's really great for the environment and it's setting up ecosystems and stuff. But right around the 70s or 80s, people realized if we just clear cut this forest and then grow coffee in the sun, it will be able to produce a lot more coffee. But the problem is it's really horrible for the environment. So a lot of people are really starting to go back to shade grown. It's less, you can't grow as much, but it's usually better quality and it's better for the environment. So when you see this, it's a good indicator that if you see shade grown, it's a pretty legitimate organization that actually treats their employees well. Because it's small organizations that are doing this with ethical, reasons. The bigger coffee plantations aren't doing this. So when you see shade grown, it's a good indicator. And then I want to talk about this really fascinating. It's called the Coffee War. I think it's kind of hyped up a little bit, but it's just I want to talk about it because it's really cool what Ethiopia did. So Ethiopia is this birthplace of coffee. This coffee started there. Like 60% of their exports are coffee. Millions of people are involved in Ethiopia with coffee farms. Most of them small coffee farms, and they produce really good coffee. I mean, there's like hundreds of different varieties and probably thousands. But they have like 3 particular varieties that they're called, they're named after their regions. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them because I probably won't do justice. But these 3, like Sadamo, and so they're named after these different regions. And coffee, like the tastes come from different regions, like different soils, acidity levels, how they're grown, like what's in the water, all that stuff. These are really premium, high-end coffees that are basically making billions around the world. But Ethiopia was only getting trickles back. They were getting 5 to 10%, even though like they were selling these coffee for like $26 a pound. Ethiopian farmers were only seeing like maybe 60 cents, and most of them were still living off $1 a day in extreme poverty. So Ethiopia had this idea that they're going to want to license these 3 premium coffees to get a trademark. And once you have a trademark, you have a lot more power over who gets the money and different trademark fees and licensing fees and all these things that you can all of a sudden bring more money back to your farmers. So they went around the world, different countries like Japan and Europe and all these things, and they asked them, and they worked with their local patent offices, and all of them were on board. They got trademarks in most of the world, but then they came to the U.S. and they got solved in the U.S. A large part, it's not just Starbucks. A large part is Starbucks is a big buyer of Ethiopian coffee, but they also had their own patent that they were working on that was some local farms in Ethiopia, and they're trying to use the same names and stuff. So it wasn't entirely like we just don't want you guys to get more money, but at the same time, I mean, they fought this and they worked and they blocked it for several years. But then Oxfam, this humanitarian organization, did this massive campaign and just put pressure on Starbucks to kind of drop their case. And in 2008 they did, and in the U.S. they got their trademarks for these 3 brands. And it's really important. I'm going to read this quote, just how important it is to have intellectual property ownership of what your products. Like intellectual property ownership now makes up a huge portion of a total value of world trade, but rich countries and businesses capture most of this. Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee and one of the poorest countries in the world, is trying to assert its rights and capture more value from its products. It should be helped, not hindered. And the result of this is they saw billions and more dollars go back to Ethiopia, and like you saw Ethiopian farmers are doubling their incomes, and they're getting a lot more money back. So this was like a huge success and so this is definitely one way to kind of move forward with coffee, with like ways to bring more money back to intellectual property rights and things. And then there's some other industries that have, you got to be careful of. There's a lot of child labor, like chocolate and vanilla. Chocolate is mainly, comes from Ivory Coast and Ghana. There's a lot of, bad industries that have, they are doing different initiatives that try to, stop the child labor, but it's not working very well. So, and same with vanilla, comes from Madagascar, and there's a lot of child labor. So if you want to, use these things, there are tons of fair trade options, for chocolates and vanillas, tons, like especially chocolates. There's like that, hundreds of fair trade chocolates that ensure that there's no child labor and that people are being treated well. So there's a comment now. It's the rose farms that are being exploded. Most roses are sold in Europe. Stores come from Ethiopia. Oh yeah, we could do a whole class on roses and cut flowers. Most of the cut flowers, come from other countries that just are operating in very exploitative environments, for sure. Um, in like free trade bananas, so 5 banana companies dominate the free trade market, and lots of abuses in a lot of different ways. All these things that we've been talking about, and then your alternative is there's a whole booming fair trade banana company operation that where it's like night and day. It's like a 180. You just see these workers treating better. They're getting more money for that. They're being protected from harsh chemicals and things. So try to buy fair trade as much as possible. There's a lot of different fair trade's really gone a long way, and there's a lot of great products out there, from flowers, from coffee, honey, all different things. So look for that fair trade as much as possible and really try to support that. And then in response to limited, also like there's a thing called Fair for Life. So there is some criticism of fair trade. There are issues they're working out. It's not a perfect model. So so there's other organizations like Fair for Life, was created to kind of supposedly to add more accountability and things. I'm not an expert. I don't know. I just know. I mean, if you see this or fair trade, it's a good chance that this is going to be better than a normal free trade market. Also, someone says European country was trying to get intellectual property rights for teff, which is a grain from Ethiopia. Yeah, so I mean that's intellectual. I mean, they call IPs intellectual property rights. It's just so important that the right people get that, so that the right people can be benefited, and not as opposed to if you don't get it, then you're going to be on the tail end, and you're going to be exploited. So it's a really important thing. So now we're going to jump into food workers' rights, and mainly going to talk about restaurant workers. So restaurant workers, restaurants is a booming industry for this country. Specifically, DC Food Policy Council released a report. I think it was like a year ago about the food economy, and the restaurants are $1 billion industry right now in DC, and they're growing rapidly. And there's a lot of people employed in our country in restaurants in some way or another, from like servers to dishwashers and things like that. But unfortunately, and there are a lot of restaurants that are treating their employees well, that are doing well, but I mean there are a lot of restaurants that are on the other end. The Bureau of Labor does a study every year of the top 10 lowest paid occupations, and then 7 out of 10 of those are restaurant workers in different parts of the restaurant. Farm workers also also are a part of that too. They're 3 times more likely to fall below the poverty line, 2 times more likely to use food stamps. And the worst part, and I think we really need to understand this, is most of them don't have paid sick days. They don't have benefits. They don't have health insurance. So you can just imagine. I mean, all the people that were probably working in restaurants that were probably sick in February and March this year that probably had COVID, but they couldn't take the days off. And it's just it's just so important that we get someday that we get these rights to these people and benefits. At the same time, there's a lot of racial discrimination. Like white male workers particularly, often get the higher pay ends and manager jobs, the head bartenders, and people of color and women are often paid less for the same jobs, and they often get like the worst jobs. And there's a lot of harassment, and this is really important. So we're going to briefly talk a little bit about what happened in Initiative 77. I'm going to try to be objective because I know there's still a lot of passionate people about this. But there were some misconceptions that a lot of people talked about, like, tipping, cause sexual harassment. Tipping, doesn't cause such sexual harassment. Tipping gives power to people that are already sexual harassers. So if your wages come from tips, and you're living in poverty, and suddenly you have a customer that's harassing you, you can't just walk away and give away that table, like if you're worried about making rent. So that's a really important thing to understand, because I saw a lot of people get that wrong on Initiative 77 in the different debates. So we'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more, but we have to understand that the tip minimum wage. So what the tip minimum wage is basically a lower wage for tip workers, a lower minimum wage, and with the idea that they're pulling in enough tips that they're actually going to still be they're still going to make enough to be at minimum wage or higher. And if not, there's a thing called a tip credit where restaurants are responsible for actually compensating employees. So if they don't make enough tips in their pay period to actually reach minimum wage, a certain amount out, restaurants are supposed to compensate them and give them the extra money to actually reach minimum wage. And but that's really where the problem is. In theory, that works really great, but in reality, that's where we see a lot of wage theft happening, and it's not always happening like your high-end stuff, restaurants and things like that. It's happening a lot, and it's happening a lot of abuse in a lot of corporate restaurants and things like that. And like, but we see that it's leaving a whole window open for wage theft to happen. And then we do have a lot of ways to like trying to stop that. We have like lawyers and laws and things. But the reality is a lot of people, especially like undocumented workers and people that they can't risk their job by filing a complaint. So a lot of people just have to eat it when their wages are stolen. So it's a difficult situation. But so 43 states have this tip supplemental wage. To give a little history about it, I mean, tipping really started in Europe as a way for aristocrats to kind of like show off their money. It didn't really get popular in the U.S. until right after the Civil War, when a lot of companies were looking for ways to hire freed Black people, but not really paying them and have them, kind of survive off of tips. And it didn't really work out very well. A lot of states actually banned tipping for a while until the early 1900s when it was kind of brought back. But it was brought back and kind of paired with a minimum wage. Especially in the 60s, we did a federal minimum wage, and we coupled that at 50% the tip sub minimum wage. So if your federal minimum wage was $5, the tip sub minimum wage had to be $2.50, and that raised to $6, and then the tip minimum wage had to go to $3. So it was paired with, as the federal government raised the minimum wage, the tip, sub tip minimum wage went up. And that, was the reality until about 1996 when a guy named Herman Cain, if you remember him, I think it's Godfather Pizzas, he ran for president a while ago. So he was the head of the National Restaurant Association, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And he convinced Congress to actually decouple that in 1996. So now when the federal minimum wage raises, which has not been raising as much as it should, but it still raises, the tip minimum wage is stuck at, and it's been stuck at $2.13 ever since they decoupled that. So the states can add to that. They can add, raise that up, but then a lot of them, they don't add a whole lot, like 22 states have added some to that. Like DC, it's like, I think last time I checked, it's like $3.33. So they've added a little bit to that, but overall, it hasn't really budged much. So there has been 7 states that decided instead of keeping that going, they got rid of the tip sub minimum wage and they pay workers the full minimum wage of their state. So workers can still collect tips. That was another misconception, is like that tips will be eliminated. They can still collect tips. They basically just got rid of the tip credit. They closed the loophole that allows a lot of wage theft to happen. And it's depending on what side you're on. There's 2 passionate sides on this. You can find data that prove that this went really well for these states in the restaurant industries, and you can find data that proved that there were negative consequences. I mean, I didn't find any data that talked about worst case scenarios, that an industry didn't collapse. There wasn't, an enormous amount of restaurants that fell under, but there was some, negative, it wasn't easy to do that, so I want to, just recognize that it's depending on, there's 2 sides to this story. And DC, we need to understand too, that DC is a very unique situation compared to most of these states. Most of these states had, had a lot of corporate, restaurants and corporate trains that could afford to do that. DC has a lot of, a single person owned restaurants, non-corporate restaurants. So it was going to be a big impact. So in 2018, to eliminate there was a referendum to eliminate the tip minimum wage. There was some issues like with the wording. People had issues with how it was worded and if it was confusing, but regardless, it was passed. But then through a lot of lobbying efforts and advocacy, the council actually stopped that, and then they overturned that referendum. And they were supposed to fund all these new initiatives to stop harassment and wage theft, but we're still waiting for these initiatives to fund. So again, like I don't have any judgment. I mean, like I don't want to like I want to say neutral because this is a tough situation because I mean it was a lot like when you're in the restaurant industry, there's I mean a lot of these people were just worried about paying rent, living paycheck to paycheck, and when your employer is saying that this passes, you're not going to be able to pay rent. I mean, it's an intense situation for both sides. So I don't really want to spend too much on that, but I want to kind of talk about like some of the bigger actors because this is not a unique situation. This is something that's happening, throughout the country. And like the biggest actor, the biggest pusher of a lot of these fights are the National Restaurant Association, which a lot of people will call it like the NRA. So the NRA, the National Restaurant Association, is this organization that I'm sure they do good work too. But I mean, a lot of what they do is they push a lot. They want to maximize profits for restaurant owners, and a lot of this they involve themselves in a lot of fights over minimum wages, over sick benefits, over public health policies, wage theft policies, things like that. And a big strategy that they use is what's called AstroTurf campaigns, where they create these platforms. Like our AstroTurf was it was called Save Our Tips. You go to that and there's all these like talking points about a really like worst case scenario talking points if this initiative passes. You can't find who created this website, or they kind of pretend like it's a fake. AstroTurfs are these fake grassroots movements like the Tea Party. The Tea Party seemed like this movement of just people that were upset, but in reality there was a lot of corporate funding and coordination and things like that. So we have to understand that even if you thought it was a good thing that this didn't pass, it's important to understand that that the actors that and a lot of the talking points and the strategies, because I mean I'm sure this isn't over. I'm sure this is going to come back up again. So it's really important to kind of understand, like even like I said, even if you're on board and not, if you're happy it didn't pass, just to understand like the people that are that are playing in this, and it's really important to understand too, because a lot of times. The more tragic part of this is like I went to a couple of debates and people have good concerns. They're worried about paying their rent, providing for their kids, but at the same time when you go to these debates, it was all the people against the issue, and that's the problem. Is if you want the people that are actually experiencing this harassment and the wage theft. These aren't the people that can just show up and debate out in public. If they debate out in public, they're going to get, lose their jobs. So it was very, there was a couple people that did, but I mean, that was because they moved on from the restaurants and they weren't worried about retribution. So that's the most important part of this is just to understand, even whichever way you go, is understand that the people that that are suffering from this are invisible. It's very similar to the farm workers and the food processing workers. This is, they're mostly people of color, and their livelihoods and their value and what's happening to them is covered up, and it's invisible. So that's what we really need to understand. Even if you're not on board with this initiative, we still need to figure out a way to support these people. And so I wrote a couple sources down just in case, because I was worried about I might get some flack from this one slide. All these things came from these articles. So if you have problems with this, take it up with these people. But that's all I'm going to say. I know this is a very passionate issue, and it's probably going to come back as well. But I just wanted to just kind of throw some context into this situation. And then I also want to know, you are protected if you work in a restaurant to organize. It doesn't mean you're not going to be retributed, you're not going to get fired, but you have legal right to sue and things like that. So it's really important if you work in an industry to understand about your organizing rights. All right, so we have about 10 more minutes left. I'm definitely going to go over. I'm probably going to go over about like an extra 15 minutes. So I'm recording this, so I'm going to keep on going. But in about 10 minutes, it'll be 1 o'clock. If anyone needs to leave, no worries at all. And I'll have the recording up hopefully later today for y'all. So we're going to talk about environmental justice now. A big thing about environmental justice is just focusing on local, trying to figure, getting away from these large giants and trying to focus as much as possible on local farms. And it's really important to understand organic certifications and what these mean. So everyone's probably seen this USDA organic. This is the national certification program. They have to be certain, organic levels. There's even, it's not great, but there's like animal welfare standards and things like that. It's a great thing to get. I encourage, get organic as much as possible. It's not just about the health for you, but it's also about creating a better food system. But the problem with USDA organic is it's just, it costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of admin work to get the certification. So it mainly is like large corporate farms, or larger, not necessarily corporate, but larger farms that have the capacity, that have admin staff. That you have to fly out you have to pay for and fly out your investigators to come out and make sure that you're doing it. So it's a lot of money, and it's tough. So that's why people created this other one. It's called the Certified Naturally Grown. And then, so this one, it's the same standards as USDA, same standards around, organic, around animal welfare, things like that. But it's much cheaper and much less admin work. It's mainly your investigators or your reviewers are your local farmers. So people that live in your county will come in, that have been certified to be, investigators will come in and investigate and then certify you. So it's very cheap. And it's a great way. So if you see this, you know that this is a local organic farm that's doing it right. So try to buy as much as possible. Try to buy stuff from these people as opposed to USDA. And if you want to find some of these people or find good local farms, there's some really great websites down here. Local Harvest. Anytime you want to find a CSA, which is a community supported agriculture, is when you pay a bunch of money up front, not a bunch, but like a reasonable amount of money up front, and then you get they use that money. The farms use that to grow your food throughout the year, and you get monthly shipments or weekly, depending on it. Farmers markets, find local farmers markets, or even find local farms. There are a ton of farms that will mail you stuff, will deliver stuff straight to your door. Amazing Grazing. This is a CASA. I always forget so CASA is this great local farm organization, nonprofit. And they run that CASA conference. It's like Chesapeake Agriculture Sustainable something. I don't know if anyone, you could type in the chat if anyone knows what CASA stands for, but they just recently did an amazing grazing directory where they found all the local grass-fed, meats and dairies in the area, and many of them will deliver directly to your door. And it's really great, especially like if you're hearing about regenerative agriculture. That's really this idea of just like, building back our planet through really sustainable means, such as like grazing means and stuff like that. So, and then the Doug Network is our local website that a bunch of us have put together. It just documents all the different CSAs and farmers markets and stuff in the area. We're in the middle of actually updating that, so it's a couple years old. So you might maybe want to, if you can't find what you can on that, check out Local Harvest. And then palm oil. So palm oil is in everything. It's well, not almost everything. It's because it's a unique type of fruit. So it's a large fruit. It's a very efficient fruit, for growing spaces. And what makes it so great is the oils from that fruit stay solid at room temperature. Most oils are liquids at room temperature, which that means things like Twinkies and crackers and all these different things that peanut butters and stuff that need to stay solid with what need oil. It works biodiesels and stuff. But unfortunately, most of it comes from Indonesia and Malaysia, and they're just clear cutting right now. Rainforests, destroying habitats. The orangutans are very close to extinction right now to this industry. Lots of labor abuses. But I have friends that actually work on creating sustainable palm oil, and they always tell me, like, don't stop buying palm oil. Try to find the right kind of palm oil, the sustainable one, and then help us build their industry out and build a demand for that. So one of these is this program called Certified Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO. And I didn't, I was like, this is a weird logo. I've never seen this. But once you see this, you'll start seeing it all over the grocery store. I first saw it with Girl Scout cookies. They have them on their logo, but a lot of crackers and stuff and peanut butters are starting to have them. It's basically, they work with local palm oil plantations to actually to maintain the natural habitats, to have workers' rights, environmental protections and things like that. So it's a really great way to support a good industry. GMOs and Monsanto. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but I was just going to give you a quick overview. So just as a clarifier, there are a lot of very intelligent people that are on both sides of this argument, and there's a lot of misinformation on both sides of this argument. A lot of people believe that we need GMOs in order to maximize, our food production and actually feed everybody, but also, but a lot of people think that it's destroying the planet, and there's a lot of issues. So I'm going to talk about some of those issues, I'll leave it up to you all to kind of make your own decision. But GMOs are genetically modified organisms. So, I mean, it's been around for like 20s and 30s, but really starting like, I think the 70s and 80s, this company called Monsanto started to develop a lot of genetically engineered GE substance seeds, subsistence seeds, like corn and rice and things like that. A lot of it, they genetically engineered like qualities and made it like drought resistant or made it, disease resistance or things like that. But the big thing that they did is their main herbicide that they use is called Roundup. So they created these Roundup resistant genes, which if you think about it, so they did that for like corn. And so like corn, you used to have to like plant corn with big rows in between so you can walk through and weed. Now they have disease resistant Roundup. They'll plant them really close together, and then they'll just like, cover the whole area with Roundup, and everything dies but the corn, which sounds great. They're increasing production, but at the same time, they're destroying our ecosystem. They're killing things that aren't just weeds. It's a lot. It's just really bad practices for the environment. So they created these seeds, and it's spread worldwide. A lot of things, like majority of our corn and soybean is GMO, and that's pretty true for around the world. But the problem with a lot of these things is, they do. Like the disease resistant seeds will eventually lose their resistance. You have to like keep on replying. You have to spend money on royalties to buy seeds every year. You have to like buy lots of pesticides and things. And then we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the seed saving. So I'm not going to blame Monsanto on the destruction of seed saving. I mean, that had a lot to do with the industrial agricultural movement, and it just was more efficient to keep on buying. It did have its impact for sure. A lot of their seeds that they do, some of the seeds they figured out how to have these terminal genetics where they don't produce, seeds again. So you have to rebuy their seeds every year. You can't seed save, but at the same time, a lot of them just they worked on to develop laws where even if they had crops that still made seeds, you couldn't actually use them by law. And it's just like it did a huge number on seed saving efforts. It definitely damaged a lot. So but I think the biggest problem, whether you're for or against it, is what scares me the most is just the monopoly that's happening right now. So there are 5 companies. Bayer just bought Monsanto, so they're one company now, but there's 5 companies, and not only control the majority of seeds and pesticides in the world, but also control 100% of GMO seeds. So if you can imagine, if we completely convert to GMO seeds, that means these 5 companies are going to control our entire food system, and that is just. And when these companies they have like what's called fiduciary responsibilities, where they have to maximize profit at all costs, and things. So it's not something that you. It's just a scary thing for me. But so a lot of countries are recognizing this, and even if they're not banning it, they're recognizing that people at least need to be aware. Because right now, we don't know. There's so many products that have the GMOs, and they don't have to label it. So a lot of countries, pass these labeling laws where it's like you have to label, if it's GMO or not. There's like third-party non-GMO, certifications. So we joined that in 2017. We passed a law to label it. We were going to call it bioengineered. Just a heads up, it's not going to be GMO. It's going to be bioengineered, from my understanding. And this is a rough draft logo. But the actual implementation of this isn't going to happen until 2022. But there are some big loopholes that people were able to get into this law. Some of them are, instead of using this code, you could just put a QR code, one of those things that you put your phone up and scan it, and it tells you a story about something. But not everyone's going to do that. Not everyone has technology to do that. If my phone's about to die, I'm not going to waste it on scanning this QR code. So that's one way to get around it. Another way is if like really processed foods that are so processed that you can't detect GMOs anymore in there, like high fructose corn syrup. They don't need to be labeled. You have to. So as long as they process all your GMO corn so much that you can't find trace elements of GMOs left in there, then they can avoid these labels. So definitely, I imagine there's going to be future battles right now over this. So definitely something, just to monitor. And then so we are destroying our oceans, which is, really bad we're overfishing, really bad for climate change, really bad for a lot of things. So there's a lot of efforts right now to try to, help people identify more sustainable and healthy fish sources. If you're not going to give up fish, there's ways to do it better. Montgomery Bay Aquarium found folks. They're like the leaders on this. They have always awesome guides, like sushi guides, local guides. They have apps where you can try to find out, like, if you're at a seafood restaurant and you're going to order seafood, you can find which ones are the most sustainable, which ones have the least toxins, things like that. There are other certification programs and things like that are good. But this is Montgomery Bay Aquarium. They have these little printout guides. You can actually take them with you. You can open them up, say, okay, so these are my best choices. These are, all right alternatives. These are the ones I need to avoid at all costs because they're either going to kill me or not kill me, but they're going to, bad for my health. And at the same time, they're bad for the environment. So, and there's want to talk about environmental racism. So I'm going to read this definition by the guy that basically came up with the definition. Environmental racism is any environmental policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individual groups or communities based on race or color. Low-income persons and people of color are exposed to greater environmental risk than white or affluent communities. And that's really important to understand. A lot of our environmental injustices that are happening in poorer communities of color, like Flint, Michigan, with lead in the pipes, or like in Mississippi and Louisiana. That's where a lot of our really toxic, industries are. There's an area called Cancer Alley where it's just all these companies sprouted up, right next to these like poor communities of color, and like it's just so tragic. Imagine like spending all your life, buying this house and then living in, and then all of a sudden this corporation, this factory opens up that's just spewing out toxins, and all of a sudden everyone in the community is getting cancer and dying. Like it's a very tragic, and your property value, plummets, and you can't sell, you can't move away. It's tragic. And one of these industries are the North Carolina pig farming industries. So they sprout all over North Carolina. They just produce millions of pigs in these tight quarters, and then they have these giant lagoons of like just pig waste. And a lot of times when they're full, they'll spray them out in the air, and pig poop will literally be raining down on the local communities around there. Most of them poor communities of color. There's all kinds of health issues and things like that. So if you're just going to keep on eating pork, I recommend not eating it. But if you are, there's a lot of great alternatives that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. That you don't have to get your pork from these industries. So I'm going to talk about that in the last section a little bit more. So and then it's really important to understand like where a lot of our food, like our processed foods, our coffee, our palm oil, they come from countries that have really awful, like authoritarian countries that have really bad paramilitary forces. And there's a lot of advocates that are fighting mainly for indigenous rights, for protecting land. Most of these are indigenous activists, and they're being murdered at pretty high rates every year. So it's important to understand that it's not just about not eating meat, but it's also, that is, we need to do that, eat less meat, but we also, and less of these products, but we also need to work on figuring out better systems and how to actually decolonize these systems. And these colonial, a lot of these governments are leftovers from these colonial environments and from global neoliberal capitalism, neocolonial stuff. So it's a bigger issue that we need to it's not just about food, but we need to think about bigger systems that are creating these situations. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is just animal agriculture. Just the environmental impact. It's one of the leaders of greenhouse gases and methane gases and water consumption. And we grow most of our food we grow is fed to animals, and then we get a very per poundage like ratios. We get very little back from that. He's one of the leaders of species extinction, Amazon destruction, all different kinds of things. Not to say that, I mean, a lot of people are making some really good cases on regenerative animal agriculture in different ways to lower your production levels, but also to kind of, bring back some carbon sequestration and bring back, more environmental, and actually heal the planet. But that's still a small percentage, a very, very small percentage. So we have to understand that majority of our animal agriculture comes from these like industrial agricultural settings. And Cowspiracy, if you haven't seen it, I mean, it's one of those documentaries where it's like, it's very biased and it's, I like it, but I mean, it's because I like what they're saying, but I mean, it's not, professional. But if you go to their website, there's this amazing fact sheet that's just got tons of like actual legitimate, like World Health Organization stats on animal agriculture, and like this is much more legitimate facts sheets. So the last section I'm going to talk about is animal welfare, and I'm just going to give you a heads up. I'm not going to really dive into how horrible it is for animals. I'm running out of time, and also I just find people shut down. Like it's a really hard thing when you actually realize the realities of these animals. But what I want to really focus on is finding better alternatives to these industrial agricultural centers and animal agricultural centers. So real quick, I mean, 56 billion animals every year are slaughtered worldwide, and at least 90%, if not more, are done in these really awful industrial agricultural settings that just do all different kinds of trauma and torture and things for the animals. I'll let you, if you want, you can read that on your own time. So a bunch of us got together a couple of years ago to create this website. It's called humanedc.org. To try to figure out better, non-factory farm solutions and vegan solutions and things like that. And we actually created this hierarchy to kind of help people out. Because, I mean, it's great. Everyone, I would love for everyone to become, vegan or all that. But it's just not a reality. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a privilege. Like a lot of people can't afford, these privileges or don't have access to it. And there's a lot of other things, even like last year when the rainforest and the Amazon were burning, a lot of people were like, we just have to stop eating meat. And yes, we got to, at least reduce or if not stop eating meat. But at the same time, if we, don't buy their meat, they're just going to grow palm oil. They're going to grow some other things. So we need to, stop eating meat. But at the same time, we also need to, deconstruct and start, these different forms of have serious conversations about, internet capitalism and things like that, and white supremacy and colonialism, and it's all like it's an and situation, not a but situation. But the idea is great if you can get up here vegan or recovered food, but then there's some other options, like if you're not going to give up meat and cheese and dairy and things like that, there's other options. And some people disagree. They're like, it's got to be all or nothing. I'm a progress, not perfection kind of person. I think as long as you're just realizing the system and trying to do what you can, meet yourself where you're at, and then over time kind of work yourself up. So we created this hierarchy, and I'll go through the hierarchy. So it is 1:10. I'll probably have about 5 or 10 minutes left of this presentation. So just a heads up, but it's okay if you want to jump off. So we're saying like the best thing you could do for animal, is eat less meat. I know people are making a strong case about regenerative agriculture and supporting that, and that's something I think for sure that's a good option. But for overall, I mean, I'm going to talk about humane options, but I mean a lot of these animals are still getting killed, so it's more humane options, not less. So the only real humane option is just not participating. And this is a great time to be a vegan in this world. There's like Happy Cow. You can find any kind of vegan restaurant around the world. Humane to see, we mapped out all different kinds of vegan. I mean, there's like DC's got like dozens of vegan restaurants. Great recipes. I mean, you have to be a little bit intentional with your nutrition. B12s and BDs. I mean, vitamin Ds you get from, really easy from dairy and meats, but you got to work on, mushrooms and vitamin supplements to get that if you're not eating meat. A big thing I tell people is a lot of people will, not a lot of people, but I hear about people that try to like make their animals go vegan. Don't do that. They're carnivores. You want to get angry at nature, but they need meat. But you can find better source animal foods, like open farms for your animals. So I can say my son was trying to convert me for 20 years, but I've learned to cook vegan for family functions. But I'm not a fan. Yeah, like I said, it's not for everyone. I encourage it, but I'm struggle with it myself as well. I'm not coming from like a place up where I figured it all out. But the idea is I'm going to walk through. So if you don't do this, here's some other options that you can do for that. So recovered food. So we also, a bunch of us started this organization called a DC Food Recovery Working Group, where we're trying to capture a lot of recovered food. Like 40% of all the food we grow ends up in the dump, from a lot of different waste, waste issues. So, but there's a lot of organizations that recover food, and they do recover a lot of meat and dairy. So that's a great option if you want to, not contribute to the market, but also get meat and dairy and stuff. Like dumpster dive. We used to do courses on dumpster diving. There was this like group house that did a dumpster diving CSA. It sounds awful, but it's actually not as awful as it sounds. It's a great way to recover a lot of food. But I'll leave that up to you guys to kind of do research that. But then there's a bunch of vegetarian reductionary options, so just finding better ethical source ways. But again, I want to emphasize that it's great, but not everyone can afford these options. So it's important to try to encourage people, but not shame people, because this is not a privilege that everyone has. So definitely, it's important to understand beyond that too. But the best option you can get if you want to still eat meat or dairy and you want to find better, higher animal welfare ways is to find local farms that are close by that you can actually visit and see how the animals are being raised with your own eyes. If they're actually in pastures. Pigs actually like forest areas. They don't like pastures as much. They like to hang out in shaded forest areas. And there's this one really cool farm called Eco Farms in Virginia. It was actually started as a pig farm that was started by vegans, which sounds crazy. But if you follow their logic for a while, it starts to make sense. They were just appalled by North Carolina pig farms and all the horrible industries. So they wanted to create a forest pig farm where the pigs can actually be a lot happier, not being confined in spaces. And they even got like a USDA grant to do their own slaughterhouse, which sounds awful, but they hire people to perform Reiki. They calm. It's like they still die. Don't get me wrong. The animals are still dying, but it's like the calmest, most humane as possible slaughterhouse. They'll literally, I think they're at different markets around there. But I think they at least a couple years ago I know they deliver it straight to people's doors. So that is a great option if you don't want to give up pork but you don't want to contribute to the North Carolina situation. And also when you're visiting, there's different things to look for, like pasture access, over milking, veal production, things like that. Definitely check this out, slide out before you visit. And then there's third-party certification. So these are, they're not all the same. They're basically, these nonprofits that will find, that will assess different situations and give you approvals. Some are better than others. Like the best ones, animal welfare organization that do animal welfare approved are like the best. I mean, you have to do all kinds of pasture, and high animal welfare, and same with global animal partnerships. This Whole Foods used to work with them. I don't know if they are since Amazon bought them. It's a different step phase. So like +5 and 5 and 4 are like the highest ones, and 3 and 2 and 1. Even 1 is still better than industrial ag, but you try to, the idea is to try to get as high as possible. And then the good ones like certified humane. There's some loopholes, and especially with chickens and stuff, it's not the best, but it's better than normal. So I definitely encourage do that. And then these all organizations, certifications, they're not about animal welfare, but they have limited animal welfare requirements. Again, it's not the best, but if you see these products, these certifications, go ahead. It's a better chance of higher animal welfare than just something that has nothing on it. So here's one question. Cheap meat is usually raised in less humane methods, but the cost cutting makes it more affordable to those making less than a living wage. The end result is humane raised meat is a luxury item. In fact, most responsibly raised food is, yeah, for sure. And that, unfortunately, that has a lot to do with like subsidies and how we heavily subsidize, industrial ag and not so much on the other end. So that's why I agree with you. It's really important. Do this if you can, but also you got to do what you got to do, especially in the middle of the pandemic, or even before the pandemic, and the most important thing is not to like shame yourself or shame others, but just be aware of this and try to, but a lot of these products, and we mapped out a lot of these products, and most of them are more expensive, but some of them aren't that much more expensive once you start identifying different things. But yeah, I definitely agree with you, Jason. global animal partnerships. So these are the step process. So they have like, +5 is like, the best, and then step 1 is, it's still better than just normal agriculture, animal agriculture, even though it's less, humane. Um, and then and then you see a lot of these like buzzwords like cage free and free range, and you really have to understand that the limits to a lot of these things. So typically, when you raise chickens, you raise them in these battery cages, and then they can't ever move, and it's a pretty awful situation. So cage free means they get rid of these battery cages, but if it only says cage free, that does not guarantee that they're actually any better. Like this is a picture of a cage free farm. So it's just as crowded, just as crazy and awful. So cage free by itself, I mean, it's a gamble, like if I see something that says cage free, it doesn't. I mean, if I can, as long as I can afford it, I might choose the cage free, but I mean, it's no guarantee. And a lot of cage free places look like this. So, and then you got free range and free roaming. There's not a whole lot to that. Maybe some outdoor access, but a lot of times it's just like, I mean, they just have to open the door and give them access. It doesn't mean that they're going out. But what you really want to look for is pasture raised or certified organic, or both of them together. So these, mean that it's so these mean that they do have access to outdoors. Again, but it's still a gamble because there's unless it's a certified company, there's no one double checking a lot of this time. So you may need to do your own research, or it is a gamble. Oh. But and at the same time too, with all chickens, even if it's the most humane environment, a lot of times they still do like chicken calling, where like male chicken, that they'll so the female chickens are the reproductive ones. So when a male chicken hatches, that they'll usually kill them, or gas them, or grind them up, or something like that. So I mean, even like the most humane stuff, it's there's a lot to the situation. So they're working on different ways to kind of get around that. Yeah. So these are really great organizations. If you see Pasture Raise and USDA at the same time, that's a really great sign. These two companies I love, Organic Valley and Stonyfield. You can get just about any dairy product, and they're all over DC. They are a little pricier. So I agree, this is a luxury item. It is pricier, but if you're looking for, something, these are worker-owned co-ops. There's like, there's probably 100 farms in each one of them, or whatever, and they all work together. It's a really great organization, and if you can afford this, I definitely recommend getting your dairy from these two organizations. And then, so we did create a Humane DC website where we try to map out all the different options, like all the vegan restaurants in DC, but not only that, but all the local humane farms in the area that will actually deliver straight to your door. We found 30 local farms that will deliver straight to your door. This was like years ago, so I mean, it might be even more with the COVID. Farmers markets that have like grass-fed meats and dairies, grocery store products and things like that. So if you're interested, this is a couple years old though, and we need to update this. A lot of this information should still be good. If you're interested in helping me update this, please let me know. I could definitely use some help. But yeah, if you're looking for trying to find better options, whether it's vegan options or better, higher animal welfare, meat and dairy, check out this website. And then, and a lot of this is like you're trying to find, so if you don't have those options, you can actually start advocating your local grocery stores. It's pretty great. I mean, it's pretty powerful actually to go to the grocery store manager and say, hey, I've been shopping here all my life, or the last 10 years, and I'd like you to have a little bit more fair trade, or what you have like, more, start, having like Stonyfield's, dairy. A lot of times they will listen to you, and they will, try out some items. There's some templates and stuff you can use. But a lot of this is about becoming a responsible consumers. When you go to the grocery store, kind of mapping out, all the products, finding the palm oil, sustainable palm oil products, finding like, the local products, and then like, again, within reason, within your budget, trying to like spend some time being like, well, what can I afford and what I can't afford, and trying to create a game plan. And then from there, also trying to, start petitions and stuff, and trying to get grocery stores to have more ethically, sources, because responsible consumerism, I mean, it is a very powerful way to bring better products to us. All right. And the last thing I want to talk about, this is the last slide, I believe, is the Good Food Purchasing Program. It's a really great organization from Oakland that they would, what they do is they help institutions, try to, ethically source using all their foods from 5 values, from local, healthy, you're treating workers right, animal welfare, sustainability and stuff. So they try to map all this stuff out and help large institutions try to source their food better. And DC Greens, a nonprofit, is working with OSSI, the people who run all the DC public schools, and we're actually working together to implement this program in DC. So it's pretty exciting. All right, so lastly, just some links and stuff about some further things about food justice events and organizations and books and things like that. But yeah, that's basically the presentation. Sorry, went over a little bit over, but thank you all so much. I'll stick around for like I'm gonna get booted. There's another meeting in 10 minutes, but I'll stick around for like another 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions or any comments or anything like that, I'd love to hear feedback too. I know I got some feedback about some of these things in the last presentation. That helped me out a lot. So definitely, but thank you all so much. We've got to go, stay safe. Yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit.
Hey, Josh, this is Jason Hawk. I just wanted to say thank you for these classes. I found them really informative. I really appreciate you doing all this hard work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, it's been a great process. I mean, a lot of this stuff we've developed over years. It's just about figuring out how to do webinars. Or sure. It took me the first couple of webinars were really awkward. But I think I'm getting there. Yeah. But yeah.
Oh yeah, you're definitely getting it. I really appreciate it.
It's still a lot to learn too, for sure, and I definitely appreciate feedback. But yeah, thank you so much for saying that.
Yeah, I just have one question or request. Could you send out directions on how to download or watch online some of the past sessions? Like I couldn't attend last time, and we were talking about fruit trees, and I really wanted to see that.
Yeah, let me post this in the chat. So I upload all these videos to YouTube, and then I post them on the Doug Network. That all volunteer garden resource center. So I'll post the link on the fruit tree workshop. It is posted right now, so you can watch that one. This new platform takes a while to download, so it may be like till tomorrow before I can get this presentation up. But yeah, definitely go to that one, that website, and you should see everything. If you have, and we have closed captioning too for people that YouTube automatically has that you can click. And yeah, for sure, let me know if you can't access it.
Okay, awesome. And there was a chicken class in the past. Have you guys thought about having that again or doing a webinar? This webinar format is much easier to attend than like in person.
For sure. Yeah, we are. I've been working for the last month to launch a summer series. Unfortunately, we had our funds frozen. All DC government non-essential stuff is frozen funding wise, but I found like a dozen different teachers, local experts are all volunteering to teaching. And one of them is our Kate McLinn, the person that teaches our chicken classes. So she will be, this summer, we will have a chicken class. I think we have like 25 classes. They're all going to be individual, so you can sign up to either one, but there's like hydroponics, canning, chicken, all that stuff. I'm hoping to get, open up registration by early the next week. Just got to wait for all the flyers and stuff to get approval, but yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm going to drop off. I have another meeting to attend, but again, I really appreciate all the hard work you've done. It's an amazing course you've put together.
Well, thank you. Hey, Paula, I ever think about putting all this info in the book? There's so much, and yeah, it's just too much information. That's my problem. Yeah, no, that'd be awesome. If I'm a terrible writer, so if anybody wants to help me with that, let me know. But that'd be cool to get into some kind of like book format. See, how do you access your YouTube channel? Yeah, if you go to that the Doug website, it's just my personal YouTube channel. I don't do anything with it. I'm just loading the videos up. Just so I can plug them in because I had no other place to put it. So, I mean, you can follow me if you want, but I mean, I'm not really an active YouTuber. Yeah, for sure. If you just go to the Doug Network where all the videos are posted and click on the YouTube button, it will pop up into YouTube and it will be my channel.
Hey, Josh. This is Alex, and I just, when Jason mentioned fruit trees, I did think of a fruit question. Have you ever grown kumquats?
Yeah, I've heard of them. I haven't really grown them though.
Okay.
But I know a lot of people will use them as rootstocks because they're supposed to be really resilient and they do really well in this area. But I don't know much about them.
Yeah. I almost bought some, but I don't really have space, so I'm gonna hold out for now.
I don't know too much about them, but I know they grow in the area and they supposedly do really well.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no other questions, then we're going to go ahead and end this. So last week's our last week for this course, and then we'll have a beginner garden class course, and then hopefully we'll transition into that summer webinar series. But yeah, see you all. Okay, thank you so much for that comment, Carol. Thank you. All right. Well, yeah, stay safe out there. See you next week.